Every revolution starts in the minds of the people.
Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today I have as my guest Colonel Douglas Macgregor. He's been on the show before. And, of course, Colonel Macgregor is widely known inside the U.S., Europe, Israel, all over the world for both his leadership in the Battle of 73 Easting, which was the U.S. Army's largest tank battle since World War II, and for his groundbreaking books on military transformation, Breaking the Phalanx and Transformation Under Fire. We'll, of course, link to those on the show notes page. Colonel Macgregor also holds an MA in comparative politics and a PhD in international relations from the University of Virginia. He's also taught at West Point. Younger listeners may remember him most for having served briefly in one brief shining moment in 2020 in the Trump administration, the first one when the president appointed him to serve as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense, a post that he held until the end of President Trump's first term. So glad to have him back with all his expertise. Colonel Macgregor, welcome to the show.
Happy to be with you.
I saw today that I guess what passes for good news, the latest news on the Ukraine war, is that the administration has decided not to rearm Ukraine with nuclear weapons. So at least we have that for the moment. They originally said that they weren't going to give them long-range missiles that could strike into Russia. They've since reversed that very recently. In your opinion, I have to believe they're not that insane or stupid. What is their goal here in escalating like this?
Well, that's a very good question, and it deserves a good answer. We have to keep in mind that we're dealing with people in this administration, and for that matter, all over Washington, who since the 22nd of February, 2022?
Two.
Seems so long ago now. They insisted that Russia was weak. Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. It has no depth in terms of its society. The population hates this evil dictator, Vladimir Putin, and so this Ukraine war will break Russia. Now, just so your listeners are aware, this fight or this battle in Ukraine evolved over a long period of time. This really stretches back to the fall of the Soviet state and the promises that we made that we would not push the borders of NATO further east until it reached or touched the borders of Russia. And of course, we discarded those things, and we ultimately began working tirelessly to arm and equip all of Russia's former enemies, and most particularly in Ukraine. We staged a coup in 2014, and we kept talking about making Ukraine a NATO member all through this, and over and over and over again, the Russians kept telling us, we don't want NATO on our border, and Ukraine cannot be a NATO member. Obviously, that's all water under the bridge. We installed a friendly government to the United States and to Western Europe that was designed primarily to be very hostile to Russia. We built up this Ukrainian force. That Ukrainian force was so large and well-equipped that in 2022, it looked as if, after having waged an artillery battle against the Russians over the previous 8 years, that this would now turn into an all-out invasion of eastern Ukraine to subjugate the Russians that were still inside Ukraine's borders and eventually retake Crimea, which was seized quickly once this coup occurred. That's over, and we're now in a very different situation. Yes, Russia began this war with a small army, a relatively few forces, and decided once they were stuck inside eastern Ukraine and saw the massive influx of weapons, ammunition, and assistance that we were providing, that Russia would have to go to a wartime stance and effectively build up its forces to eventually drive out the Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine, liberate those territories that are populated by the Russians, and then hopefully reach some sort of agreement. In the midst of all of this, there were negotiations which we subsequently sabotaged with the help of our friend Boris Johnson and told the Ukrainians, no, 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 fight to the end. We'll be with you. We'll give you anything you want. You have no chance of losing. We're the great power in the world. The Russians will be defeated. So these were the promises made in April of 2022 to Zelensky and his crowd, and they've stuck with that. Obviously, that hasn't worked out very well for Ukraine. So if we look at the losses the Ukrainians have been taking, and the worst losses, of course, have been within the last few months, they have at least 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, probably much more. The Russians have lost somewheres in the neighborhood of perhaps 80,000, 70 or 80,000 dead, another 30 or 40,000 wounded. So you have on average, a 1 to 7 or 1 to 6 ratio. For every one Russian killed or wounded, you have 6 or 7 Ukrainians killed or wounded. And surprise, surprise, Ukrainians have run out of manpower to put into uniform. They no longer have a trained and well-equipped force. So the war is, for all intents and purposes, effectively over. And the Russians are very deliberately, but now at greater speed, moving west towards the Dnieper River. And they've built their forces up to the point where they now have over 800,000 troops in and around Ukraine. And of that, they've got 180,000 poised to launch major offensive operations straight to Kiev. So this is in its final phase. And we, of course, refuse to recognize this. So we keep harping on this narrative. Oh, the Russians are weak. The Russians are stupid. The Russians are losing. And if we just give Mr. Zelensky one more item, one more thing, he's going to be successful. That's all nonsense. The only thing that we could do at this point is wish him well, but urge him to negotiate. And I think that's privately behind the scenes what is unfolding. But the administration has successfully propped up the facade of a government in Kiev, maintained the fiction that there's still a Ukrainian state, which there really isn't, until the election. And that was their principal goal. The question is now, what will President Trump do with what remains? Because the balance of power in Europe between us and the Russians has shifted dramatically in favor of the Russians. And so that changes the calculus strategically, rather dramatically.
A couple of weeks ago, I saw you, it might have been on Fox News, and I don't remember the gentleman's name who was on the same segment. But he was, kind of trumpeting this idea that Putin has, more territorial ambitions and that he wants to eliminate Ukraine as a state, which, of course, I didn't believe when the war started, and he basically sat down in this what you called a banana-shaped, great description,
Yeah.
this strip of land from somewhere around Kharkov down to south to Mariupol, and then west to Kherson. But now that he is moving west, do you think that Putin, if a peace can be made, does Putin allow the Ukrainian state to continue?
Well, I think he will if we ultimately come to certain terms with him. First, we need to come to terms with the reality that for Ukraine to continue to exist and escape from this terrible war, it needs to be neutral, not part of the NATO alliance. And to be perfectly frank, NATO behind the scenes is crumbling and falling apart. People don't realize the level of discontent and division that dominates the discussions behind the scenes. Many, many NATO members, remember, we used to have 18, 19 members. Now we're at 32, pushing this entire alliance with all these various states and people in a particular direction is like herding cats. And if you live in Croatia or Slovenia, if you live in Spain or Italy, why would you be remotely interested in going to war with Russia? Well, the truth is the people that live in these places are not interested in that. And for that matter, the populations of France and Germany don't want to go to war with the Russians. Neither do the Poles at this point. But the governments that are in power are these globalist regimes that have been pushing all the policies and thinking that we frankly have come to loathe and hate about their societies. In other words, they're anti-nationalist, they are anti-religious, anti-Christian, and they are demonizing anyone who doesn't agree with them. They have been suppressing free speech, filtering the news, projecting an image that is entirely false of Russia. And the people in these countries have begun to figure this out. The question is, how soon will Schultz in Berlin be gone? How soon will Macron finally be gone? How soon will this man Starmer, who seems to be perhaps the chief lunatic in London, be gone? We don't know, but they're all on very, very shaky ground. And none of the military establishments in NATO are ready to take on the Russians. These are all little boutique forces. The British Army today is roughly, 70,000, 75,000 men. That's smaller than the United States Marine Corps. If you start going through the French side, they have perhaps, 120,000. What are you going to do? Take these little boutique forces from various nations, cobble together an alliance and send it into Ukraine? It's absurd. And we're overstretched and we're worn out. We have no capacity to deal with the Russians on the ground. So we're falling back on the usual, bully, bribe, or bomb. That's the mantra in Washington. Bully, bribe, or bomb your opponent or the individual that won't go along with you. Doesn't work with Russia. Doesn't work with Iran. Doesn't work with China. It's not going to work with most of the world anymore. And that's the sad truth.
I want to talk about Trump and what he might do, but just your comments there. When you're talking about nuclear powers, I guess what's always in the back of my mind is, I mean, even the idea of the United States or one of the other nuclear powers or a collection of them going to war with Russia, it's kind of a fake war. It's a make-believe war because no country is really going to surrender to the other without resorting to nuclear weapons. I mean, before surrender. And I want to believe that no one wants to go there. What do you make of all that? A conventional war between nuclear powers? Is it all just a game for
No,
funding
no,
or
no, no. It's very serious. And the simple truth is, if we fight what I would call a high-end conventional war, which is what the Russians have done in eastern Ukraine, we would lose. And that's the danger right now. This started back in the late 60s and early 70s when we went to something called flexible response, where we recognized that going to the nuclear level was Armageddon. It was suicide. And if you listen carefully to both Vladimir Putin, what he said, what Mr. Trump has said in the past, a nuclear war is off the table because if we engage in it, everybody dies. Of course, Mr. Putin pointed out that if they do, then we'll go to heaven as martyrs since we didn't start this thing. Well, that's fine. All the best. But
right?
I don't think they or we even want to contemplate for a second the use of nuclear weapons. I think if Trump as president, one thing he will do, I feel reasonably confident, is he will say no to escalation to the nuclear level. But keep in mind that that's going to be tough because we face the very real probability in the Middle East, as well as in eastern Ukraine, of losing. I would argue the war in Ukraine has long since been lost. The best thing we can do for the few remaining Ukrainians in Ukraine is to stop this war, to try and salvage what we can from it, not for the purposes of turning it over to BlackRock and other vulture capitalists to rape and pillage the Ukrainian state of whatever it's got left, but really to save the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. And that's right now, that's everybody who's west of the Dnieper River. And I think that Putin is absolutely, totally disinterested in what anybody does west of the Dnieper River, provided they're neutral and not a member of NATO, provided we are not there supplying weapons and inducing hostile action against Russia. And unfortunately, you've got a lot of people in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. I don't think Romania it's the case anymore, maybe to a lesser extent in Finland, who really think that they can fight and win against Russia. They can't. We can't. This goes This goes back many years to the simple truth that we are primarily a maritime and aerospace power. We're not a land power. Our presence in Europe is anomalous in history. It's anomalous in Asia. We became involved in these places largely as a consequence of the Second World War. We've always been focused here in the Western Hemisphere. And here, obviously, we are king. We are a land power in North America and in the Western Hemisphere. We can't compete with any continental power on the size and scale of Russia or China or even Iran over the long term. That's something we refuse to accept publicly, but everybody privately knows that's the case. So the real question is, well, then, if it doesn't make sense for us to wage war in these places against powerful continental adversaries, what the devil are we doing? And I think Americans are asking that question. And for the moment, I think we have two answers. One, we want to continue to pretend in Europe that we're something good and powerful and that we've harmed Russia. In reality, we've harmed ourselves. And I think we've put NATO and ultimately the European Union on the path to extinction. The European Union will go down first. That's because of all the pointless sanctions and trade obstacles that we put in place to punish anybody who cooperates in any way, shape, or form with Russia. Well, that's an impossibility. And now we're trying to do the same thing with China. That won't work. The second part of this is we have the Middle East. And the Middle East, we're trying to make the region safe for Israel. Well, I think that's a possibility, but not when you wage war against everybody in the region, which is effectively what Israel has chosen to do and wants us to help them win. In other words, Israel is not in the business right now of defending itself. It hasn't been for some time. They're waging offensive war beyond their borders. And what's happening today in Syria is the tip of an iceberg that's emerging now from great depths. We're looking at a large-scale regional war involving Iran, Russia, potentially the Turks, all of the Arab states in the region, and Israel. Well, this is catastrophic. This is not going to end well, certainly not for our Israeli friends. There are, what, 6.5 million Jews in Israel? And you're talking about hundreds of millions of people surrounding them who are now, for the first time in centuries, coalescing into an alliance against them. You have an outlier like Turkey, and that's something we should discuss because the Turks are behaving in very dangerous ways right now that could make matters worse.
So we have the Trump administration coming in, and he certainly ran on, among other things, changing the foreign policy, certainly talking something like the old realist approach when the Soviet Union was still around. Um,
Really? Have
but
you
how
seen
do you?
evidence for that? Because I haven't seen any evidence for that. I've listened
Well,
to Mr. Waltz, who is the new up and coming national security advisor, say that there is no daylight between him and Jake Sullivan.
well, I guess what I was going to say is, given what Trump himself has said and saying things like, "I want to rebuild the military, but we don't have to use it," and those kinds of things. But then the appointments, that's what I was getting to is how do you reconcile what he claims to want to do, make peace on his first day in Ukraine, and I want this war in the Middle East over my first day, and then he's appointing these, I hate to use the tired term neocon, but Hegseth's an old Bushy. Rubio's been one of the more
Yeah.
bellicose in the Senate. How do you reconcile that?
Well, you can't. And you have to look at what people do. You should listen to what they say, but really measure the importance of whatever they've said by what they actually do. And right now, I would say that we're on a path to an even more belligerent foreign and defense policy overseas than what we've had under Biden. And remember that the Israelis have been sort of unhappy with Biden because they've never been entirely certain that they could depend upon him. And Biden has slow rolled the Israelis on certain munitions from time to time. He's expressed his discomfort with this policy or strategy of mass murder and expulsion in Gaza, which they also want to repeat on the West Bank. I think the Israelis are trying to set the stage for the arrival of Donald Trump. on the assumption that once he becomes president, they will have essentially a blank check and that he will initiate the war with Iran, which is ultimately what the Israelis want, because they see everything in the region that they don't like as going away with the destruction of Iran. I don't necessarily think that makes a lot of sense, but that's the view. And then you go to Ukraine and you have to look at the people that he's listening to, this man Kellogg and Flights, who've concocted this ridiculous notion that we can go to Ukraine, go to Moscow and tell Putin and his government, look, if you don't sit down and negotiate with the Ukrainians, we're going to make matters worse for you. We're going to send even more equipment over there. And in the meantime, our plan for you is that we'll create a safe zone and then we'll introduce NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine to police it. I mean, this is sheer unadulterated fantasy. There's no chance of any of that happening. And I think there's a failure to come to grips with just how radically the world has changed. And, Tom, I would say it's not just the world, but also the United States. I don't think that the people coming to power in the Trump team are really in touch with just how profoundly things have changed in the United States. They certainly understand what the impact of illegal immigration has been, and that's very good, and they want to reverse that, although I'm not sure how they plan to do it. They talk about securing the border, but I haven't heard anybody explain how they really plan to do it. In other words, they want to do many things here at home that are very important, but I haven't seen planning behind these actions. Now, perhaps they've done the meticulous planning that's required, but I kind of doubt it because I didn't see it in the last administration. So
Yeah,
you've got a problem here at home with the economy. I mean, your bond yields are rising, and at the same time, we're trying to drive down interest rates. Guess what? Interest rates aren't going down. Well, why not? Well, we had this problem, this debt load that we cannot easily jettison. Trump used to talk about it. Then he was told by his handlers, don't mention this. But the truth is we're headed to some sort of crisis financially that'll probably lead to default. And it probably needs to, because there's no way in hell that we can come up with the funds and the goods to pay off the national debt. It's not going to happen. And you can't do these things while you're waging these conflicts overseas. These conflicts are costing us a lot of money. We have multiple carrier battle groups. Most of the U.S. Air Force, it's strung across the Middle East all the way up to Finland. Now I'm told we have B-52s sitting in Finland. What a disaster, right on the Russian border. And the Russians are looking at all of this, and they're saying, have you lost your minds? You really want to go to war with us? And this is what Putin has been trying to get across to us. Don't you understand what these threats to us mean? And I don't think they do. I don't think people in Washington understand the consequences of their actions. And I don't think that, President Trump and his team understand the numbers of judges, people in the judiciary establishment in the country that are fundamentally anti-American. They hate the United States and they hate him. And how else do you end up with all these criminals released on the streets of New York, Chicago, and all the other major cities in the world? We've got a real problem. And this is, I think, the message I want your listeners to hear that's most important. Any president who tries, on the one hand, to manage conflict overseas, while he's also trying to make profound change here at home, will fail. You can't do both. The last president who tried was Lyndon Johnson, and he failed miserably. He had his Great Society and war on poverty and all these things. It all died. Where? In Vietnam. Now, what we're dealing with in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe potentially is much, much worse than Vietnam. Remember, wherever we've gone, in most cases, we have not fought real armies. The last time we fought a real army was in 1991. That army wasn't particularly good. It wasn't as well trained and well equipped as we are, but it was an army with all the accoutrements and air defenses and capabilities we associate with armies. Since then, we've been dealing with people running around in bed sheets and sandals with AK-47s and command detonated mines. That's over. Iran is a great power. It may not be as great as we are, but they have substantial capabilities. In other words, we're treating the region as though it's 1973. And these are backward Arabs and backward Persians and backward Turks and backward this. No, these people are actually rather sophisticated, and they've got capabilities they never had before. And when you move to Russia, we still haven't figured out that Russia has changed dramatically from what it was 30 years ago. Dramatically, for the better. I mean, Russia is not a communist state. Russia is not a messianic state. Russia doesn't want to invade anybody. Russia wants to do business with us and everybody else. In fact, most of the world really wants to do business with us. And we keep punishing people for not towing the line in this foreign policy that we insist is the way to go, which is endless confrontation with everyone and anyone who is different from us, who doesn't buy into our political system, who doesn't want to be ruled by us, dominated by us. Our financial system is hated because we've used it as a weapon against people. This is why you've got BRICS and this alternative economic structure developing. It's a new financial system. It's going to take years to develop, but it's well on its way because people want to get out from under us. And ultimately, all of the currency in that world is going to end up being backed by gold and potentially other commodities. While here in the United States, what are we backing our currency with? Hot air, a printing press. There's nothing there. So all of these things are linked. And if you're serious about what you want to do as a president coming into office here in the United States, you want to recover our country. Everybody is talking about roads and bridges falling apart. Everybody's talking about the rise in crime, the Venezuelan gangs that are running all over the country, which are a modest form of internal civil war. But we've got millions of people in the country. We don't know where they're from, how they got here. There are at least 52 to 55 million people inside the United States who were not born here. So we've got a problem. What are you going to do, Mr. President? Are you going to run around the Middle East trying to make it safe for Israel? Are you going to run around in Eastern Europe trying to beat down the Russians who have already won and are prepared to beat us into submission? What do you want to do? Or do you want to stay home and fix the mess that we ourselves have created? That we don't have armies on our borders poised to invade. We've done the damage to ourselves. We opened our borders. We failed to enforce our own laws. That's what's gotten us to where we are now. We've overspent to the point of absurdity. And now we're discovering that Russia has, for a lot less money invested, built an infinitely better and more capable defense establishment than we have. So we got real problems. You can't do everything. If he tries to do everything, he will fail.
You've been in the administration. You've advised the president. I want to believe that some of what I'm hearing is Trump's, whether this is smart or a wise way to go about it or not, it might be his style, that he wants some bluster and he wants some to talk tough for political reasons. And he thinks that he's going to be in a better position to negotiate, but honestly wants to negotiate these conflicts to an end. Is there any chance of that based on your experience with the man and being in the administration?
Donald Trump is a nice guy. And I mean that sincerely. In my dealings with him, this is a very nice human being. Donald Trump's intentions are clearly very, very pure. He means what he says. But the follow-through is lacking. And much of that, the last time around, was due to the people that he selected for key posts. He would tell them to do one thing, and they went down a different road. And then he committed a terrible sin. No president should do this. He let them stay in office. He did not punish any of them. He didn't remove them. I've told several people this story, and it's an important one everybody needs to remember. When JFK was inaugurated, And initially, JFK did not like General Eisenhower, his predecessor. But he asked him sort of snidely as he was walking away from the inauguration, well, General, do you have any last bits of advice for me? And Eisenhower turned to him and said, yes, I do. And he said, what's that? He said, be a good butcher. And of course, Eisenhower was shocked, or rather, JFK was shocked. And he said, what do you mean? He said, you will have people working for you who will betray you. They will disobey you. They will lie to you. They will fail to do what you tell them. When that happens, you must remove them immediately. You got to fire them and throw them out, or that will rot. In other words, the whole thing will metastasize. And he said, if you can't fire them, that's not your nature, then find someone else who will do the dirty work for you and walk down the hall and say, you're out. You're gone, Mr. Secretary. Resign. We want you out of here. He said, if you don't do that, you will fail. Well, JFK, who was also, basically speaking, a nice person, was rather shaken up by all of this. But then he went through the Bay of Pigs, and then he got involved with the missile crisis. And boy, did he learn the hard way. He figured it all out. Well, Donald Trump is similar in that regard. He's too nice. And some of these people are not people that he would normally pick. But that's because he has donors. And this is something Americans have to take into consideration. You know, when you run for president of the United States today, even if you run for the Senate, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in order to compete in these unending campaigns that begin at least 2 years out before you even become a candidate. They'll eat you alive. And so you've got to go to people for money. So look at the donors. Who are the big donors to the Trump campaign? Who are the people that helped him win and seize control of the presidency? What do they think and what do they want? He cannot completely ignore them. Now, he can ignore them to some extent once he's in there, if he wants to, but it's dangerous because they can also take action against him in other areas. And remember, he's been through hell already. He's been in and out of court. The attempt was lawfare. Bankrupt Donald Trump, destroy him financially. Then he poses no threat. Many of the people that donated to his campaign have helped him get through that. So he can't just walk away and say, I know I promised to do this and this and this, but I really can't do it. It's a difficult position, but he's got to also think about what's in the interest of the American people. And one of the things that I keep telling people that are in politics, particularly people that are now working for him, is that no one, I have seen no evidence that there's anyone in the United States of America that wants to go to war with anyone. The exception being perhaps Mexico, because people do realize that Mexico is an organized crime state. And all these statements about, well, I made a deal with the president of Mexico, forget it. She's irrelevant. She controls maybe 40 square miles of downtown Mexico City if she's lucky. It's an organized crime state. We are at war with the organized crime state known as Mexico right now, and they're killing us. They're killing hundreds of thousands of us every day with drugs and criminality and so forth. So the top priority is you got to secure that border. That can only be done by the American military, and that's the job of the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army was on that border from 1846 to 1948. It's time to get them back on the border. And they were there for a reason, because Mexico has always been unstable, and there has always been an enormous amount of criminality in the country. Human trafficking, drug trafficking, traffic what you will. We need to stop that. But when we do that, Tom, you're going to have a war inside the United States, because lots of people are going to lose a lot of money. If you stop the drugs from pouring into the country, seriously, use the Coast Guard where it belongs here in home waters, bring back naval power. It's going to be needed in the Caribbean Basin and the Pacific coasts. If you do that, the drug cartels are going to fight you, and they are dug in deeply inside our country. So that's much more important than anything happening overseas. But no one has donated money to Donald Trump for the purpose of inducing him to close the border. You get me?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, let's hope. I mean, at least there's some hope, I think, with a new we know what the old administration, which Kamala Harris would have just been a continuation. We know what they were going to do, and let's hope that despite some of these disturbing appointments, we get something at least marginally better. Colonel Macgregor, always a pleasure to speak with you, and hopefully you'll make some time to come back on after Trump gets in there and we can assess how it's going.
Well, sure, Tom, just to remind all your listeners, if you go back to 2016, every time Donald Trump showed up at a massive rally, because people like Donald Trump. I like Donald Trump. Okay, I support Donald Trump. But every time he showed up, what did you hear from the audience? Build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. Well, he says, well, I built 300 miles of barriers. Sorry, didn't work. This time around, it has to happen. And everybody listening needs to remember that. And that's existential for our country. No borders, no enforcement of law. Pretty soon, no country at all. Okay.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Again, appreciate the time, Colonel Macgregor, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks. Same to you, Tom. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.